Hello folks, and welcome back to my channel. It is another book review, and this one is a little bit interesting. If y'all remember, not that long ago, we reviewed In the Flesh, The Cultural Politics of Body Modification here on this channel, and this one was a really good, really interesting, really heavy read. And one of the things that struck me in the section about modern primitivism was talking about the way a lot of the modern primitive movement came about, particularly in North America, was very much derived from some pretty problematic racist practices. And a big thing that we talked about was the Hottentot Venus. So a number of scholars have recently described how these modern images of primitivism were exemplified in the 19th and earliest 20th century freak shows and ethnological exhibits. These exhibits created a public theater for the discursive production of the primitive as exceptional and anomalous. Among the most famous instances of that is the Hottentot Venus, the African sand woman who was displayed in the earliest 19th century in a cage outside Piccadilly Circus in London. Sarah, as she was called, was displayed, treated, and conceptualized as little better than an animal, and repeatedly compared to an orangutan, as Lynn Forrest put it. Her story was echoed in many other exhibits across cities in Europe and the United States, in which foreign bodies, especially women's bodies, were represented not only as essentially different than Western ones, but as uncultured, savage, wild, sexually unrestrained, and dangerous. Indigenous cultures were seen to provide aesthetic titillation in the form of their body practices, rituals, foods, and social institutions. Even as colonized cultures were being destroyed with increasing brutality, Europeans and white Americans romanticized them as closer to nature, more communal, and more sexually pleasured, notions of the primitive that continue to persist in the Western imagination. This led me to talking about this in my review, which led to a commenter letting me know that I should read Fearing the Black Body, which is all about the racist history of fat phobia and body politics. And I read the description of this book and I was immediately fascinated and wanted to pick it up, and recently finished it, and wow. It's one of those things where, logically, I'm aware that so frequently stuff circles back to white supremacy and to racism, but to see it all laid out and explained and researched is still startling and still jarring. And to realize how our current culture's preoccupation with thinness and particular body types is so deeply, deeply rooted in white supremacy and a fear of other races. And you might be thinking, Lynn, how is this relevant then to body piercing and body modification? Obviously In the Flesh is all about body modification, but where does Fearing the Black Body fall? And the piercing and tattoo industry, I would say a little bit more the tattoo industry, if we're being totally honest, has a similar preoccupation with thinness. Look at Inked magazine, look at Suicide Girls, look at the perceived body type of the ideal modified person, and particularly the ideal modified woman. I'll never forget, in doing work for an article on fat phobia in the piercing industry, interviewing Bex, she talked about the fact that you can be the fat tattooed funny guy. That is an archetype that exists for heavily modified fat men, but there is no archetype that exists for heavily modified fat women. In fact, larger bodied women and feminine presenting people just don't really have a place or see a lot of representation in the body modification industry whatsoever. It is all very, very slim or slightly curvy, usually white or lighter skinned models that represent tattoo and piercing in all of the magazines, in all of the advertisements, on the TV shows, all of these things. And to see in this book in particular, it laid out so well an understanding of how we got here and how racially rooted it is was incredibly eye-opening. In a discussion from Fearing the Black Body about the Hottentot Venus, about Sarah, they state, whether fact or fiction, the purported size of her bottom in tandem with her presumed general rotundity placed Sarah beyond the pale of fair-skinned European norms of beauty. Racial theories had linked fatness to blackness in the European imagination, and they had also linked thinness to whiteness. Values of delicacy, discipline, and a slimmer physique were becoming associated with English women by the arbiters of taste and purveyors of morality. Far from being a coincidence, the fear of being uncultivated and thus like racial and national others lay at the heart of these developments. So when we look back, we see, particularly in depictions of the goddess Venus, a full-figured, voluptuous Venus depicted by many. When we think of the Medici Venus, and when we think of like Rubens and his paintings of fuller figured women, this was a standard of beauty for a very long time. As we begin to see the slave trade grow, and as we begin to see this sort of like freak show exhibit of Black and brown bodies, we begin to see a distinction occur in medical literature and scientific literature, and also religious literature of the time, linking Blackness to fatness and whiteness to thinness, and leading to thinness being considered a more desirable trait and also a more moral trait by a lot of authors. One quote that was very popular at the time was, "They were making graves with their own teeth." Citing the Greek theorist Heraclitus, he warns that the wisest soul dwelleth in the most empty body. So basically stating that people who were eating too much, they were gluttonous, they were indulgent, that people who restrained and limited themselves on food and were in a slender, svelte body were inherently wiser because they had better control over their appetite or over their worldly desires. Around this time, we also see some big developments in race theory. So we see a divide in Europe between what's considered like the ideal high countries or the Aryan race, and then low countries, which are people who are basically like lesser whites. And then we have Black and brown folks from there. And so they take a lot of digs at painters like Rubens and people who are from these so-called low countries as also being larger and bigger bodied. The open dig at the standards of taste in the Low Countries, including a probable reference to the full body style rendered by Rubens, is further evidence of the elite English desire to create a social distinction on the basis of nation and appearance in the early 18th century. Fat, presumed to be the product of immoral and irrational intemperance, was considered lowbrow. In women, it also became comically unattractive. So in the time period of just a couple hundred years, we go from seeing Rubens painting these robust, full-figured women as this ideal beauty and celebrating them, to people making digs that if you're fatter, you're from a lesser country, you're from the Low Countries. It is an obscenity to be fat or in a larger body. The greatest and most general misleader of our judgments in relation to beauty is custom or different national tastes of beauty, which turn chiefly on the two lower parts of it, color and form. It was from the most common shape of his countrywoman that Rubens, in his pictures, delights so much in plumpness, not to give it a worse name. Whenever he has to represent the most beautiful women, he is sure to give them a good share of corpulence. It seems as if nobody could be a beauty with him under 200 weight. His very graces are all fat. Criteo also reveals that the English model is not only distinct from those of other nations, it is superior to them. There is a disdain in his prose as he describes the voluptuous woman in Rubens' paintings, as if to suggest that the Flemish mode of beauty is not only different, but lower. It is predominantly English critics and philosophers who are taking this view of extreme skinniness and svelteness as sort of like the epitome of beauty, the one true standard of beauty, and stating that forms of beauty celebrated in other cultures or other nations exist, but make those nations lowbrow, lowly, or lesser than. It is evident then that in Criteo, Spence is delineating a national and racial hierarchy of beauty. In it, English women were at the top. Women of other European nations were below them, and at the bottom were colonial racial other women, specifically Asian and Black women. Fearing the Black body so exceptionally shows this with an incredible amount of research from art critics to magazines to popular culture to political writing to religious sermons. The way that Europe particularly shifted from favoring and enjoying fuller figured bodies to, specifically because of the introduction of people of other races into Europe and their different body types and shapes, specifically linking fatness and largeness with racial others, and then denoting it as this awful bad thing, and basically saying that this European and particularly English style of beauty of being extremely thin is this idealized beauty. And not only that, but when it comes to men, that men are wiser, smarter, and somehow more moral if they are thinner. And the evidence is overwhelming. I feel like I could just sit here and read quote after quote after quote from this book. I'm just going to encourage you to pick up the book and read it yourself. But the author does a really, really, really incredible job tying all of this together. And it puts so much in perspective how we've come to this place where we so deeply fear fatness and different body types, and we segregate body types the way that we do. And for me, this feels relevant to the piercing and body modification industry because I think we as an industry still have a really big struggle with this. We lack a lot of representation. I think tattooing in particular lacks a huge amount of body diversity representation and skin tone diversity representation. I mean, a quick scroll through like the Inked magazine covers of like the last 10 years shows you that easily, right? So I think it is so important for us to look outside the bounds of our own industry and to listen to voices that are more knowledgeable in other areas than us. And if we are sitting here and saying we want to make body modification a safer, better, more inclusive, more well-represented industry, part of that is going to be going outside of the sphere of body modification and listening to what other scholars, other educators, and other researchers have to say. And for me, as someone who has written a lot about fat phobia in the industry and talked a lot about racism and cultural appropriation in the industry, fearing the fat body feels relevant. It feels important for me to understand how we got to where our current culture is in regards to thinness and size, how heavily influenced by race and eugenics theory and religious concepts that was, to understand what it is that I am fighting against now in order to make this industry a safer place. And I feel like we have to really understand the issue well in order to understand how to fight against it. And this book to me gave me incredible insight in how to create a safer space in my studio for larger bodies and how to better navigate conversations with peers in the industry regarding fat phobia, and gave me a much better idea of all of the systems at play that have led to things like most of the Inked magazine cover girls that I can remember in my career being like super skinny white women. It all makes sense. And weirdly enough, we can thank John Kellogg for a lot of it. Like, I feel like it keeps circling back to him. Serial circumcision, fat phobia. John Kellogg had his hands in everything, I guess, in early America, and what an awful time that was. But the latter chapters in this that detail like the American obsession with thinness, really hits hard to read how a lot of that came to be here. I'd like to end this with another quote from Fearing the Fat Body that just hits so hard for me. This suggests that, as had been shown throughout, discussions about racialized and gendered fat and slender bodies circulated largely in elite white spaces and among white persons prior to the mid-20th century. They served as a mechanism for white men and women to denigrate the racially othered body. They also worked to police and applaud the correct behaviors of other white people, especially white women. This is the crux of the issue. The image of fat black women as savage and barbarous in art, philosophy, and science, and as diseased in medicine has been used to both degrade black women and discipline white women. For decades, white feminist scholars and historians focus largely on the impact of the thin ideal on middle and upper class white women. They claimed that the thin ideal was oppressive, but also suggested that they did not know how it developed. This book endeavors to address that question, adding a much-needed intersectional component to the analysis of the development of fat phobia and the slender aesthetic, revealing race to be the missing element in many of these analyses. Indeed, the racial discourse of fatness as coarse immoral, Black, and other not only denigrated Black women, it also served as the driver for the creation of slenderness as the proper form of embodiment for elite white Christian women. In other words, the fear of the Black body was integral to the creation of the slender aesthetic amongst fashionable white Americans. We can only understand how we got to where we are by looking at the past and connecting these dots. And it is for that reason that fearing the Black body is absolutely going on my media list, even though it is not directly related to tattoo and body piercing. I think it answers a larger question of images of idealized beauty in the industry. And I think reading this is essential would be essential for folks who want to unlearn their own internalized fat phobia, show up better for bigger clients, and really try and make themselves an accessible space for everyone who wants to get a piercing, and everyone who wants to get a tattoo, and everyone who wants to celebrate the body that they're in. But we have to learn about how we got here in order to truly change what we're doing and create a safer and better space. This one definitely gave me a lot to think about. It was definitely a very heavy read, but it really is eye-opening, and Sabrina Strings has done an incredible amount of research in putting this together, and it really shows you how truly racially driven this subject is, and it really makes you re-examine why we hold on to the beliefs we do about weight and size and thinness. This one's a little bit different than some of my other book reviews, but I am slowly starting to add more diverse books into my reading and more intersectional books into my reading, because I think we as an industry have this habit of only reading things that are very specifically centered around tattoo and piercings, which makes sense because that's like the industry we're in, that's the stuff we're curious about to read and explore. But I think we limit ourselves because the pool of people writing about stuff directly related to the industry are usually people inside the industry who suffer from the same, subconscious biases and input that we all do, because we're all kind of within the same space viewing it from within. And I think when we start to pull from those outside of the space and start to look at broader, bigger pictures, we do a lot better for ourselves, for our peers, and for our clients. And we allow ourselves to lean on the expertise of folks who are in other industries and other fields who know things that are relevant to what we are doing. So Fearing the Black Body was incredible. Thank you so much to the commenter who recommended it. I strongly suggest it as something to pick up and read, and it is very much going to inform how I try and tackle fat phobia in my studio and in my piercing room and with my suspension team and in the industry in general. And I hope that in reading more intersectionally like this and maybe suggesting more like this, I can encourage others to have similar conversations, similar experiences, and we can all work together to try and make things better here in the body modification world. Thanks so much for sitting down and chatting. I can't wait to sit down and talk with y'all again next week. Bye.